So I want to talk about the biggest coincidence in the world, which it's not an actual coincidence, but I use sarcasm in my videos to make the people think, and it's something that, like, if you take on face value what is kind of like the framework that you have to adopt in order to function for the larger society to function in the current economic system which we have. This is, like, just a huge coincidence. Like, people, it's kind of hard to explain. And the framework which people have to adopt is obviously, we live in kind of like a meritocracy. Like, it's not totally perfect, obviously, but more or less, if you work hard, you can do well. And, the harder working people do better than the poorer working people, and that transfers to communities. The harder working, communities with their heads on straighter do better, and then there's other communities that can't get their shit together. And then that actually happens for countries as well. And this is more of a right-wing framework, but it's pretty much been adopted by the mainstream liberals as well, even though they don't use the same type of rhetoric around it. In terms of, like, you notice, like, obviously, right-wing people will say, you need to work hard, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Trump will talk about shithole countries, which is a little bit vulgar for the, more civilized, sensitive conservatives who would use, more vague language. But more or less, that's, like, what they believe. That's why they think we shouldn't help these other countries. They need to work hard like Americans. That's the American spirit. That's why, we have succeeded so much, and these other countries is more collectivist, lazy kind of ethics. That's why they haven't prospered. And that's why they're not, those conservatives and Trump are not in favor of welfare programs for communities which aren't, like, the laws aren't, they're not discriminating, that we're not discriminating against them anymore in terms of explicit racial biases, just based on the race of people. And so, they need to, now it's a problem of values. Ben Shapiro will say it. Everybody says it. They say it in different ways, more subtle and less subtle ways. And even the Democrats more or less kind of agree with, because it's Bill Clinton that cut welfare and in general, and the New Deal. Obama was looking for a grand bargain to cut, potentially cut Medicare and Social Security. Like, the New Deal welfare programs have been cut for a while. And if you listen to the rhetoric of Democrats, they'll have more. There'll be more stuff around. We need education, which I agree. I think we should fund education, whether it's colleges or technical schools or whatever it is. I think it's good if people have access to that. But what is kind of like the the reason that that's taken kind of center stage? It's because the view is that if just these communities would educate themselves better, they would know more, they could do better within society. And so we're going to help them up a little bit here, but it's also kind of like has a view in it that's baked in, which is kind of central to the central managerial class type worldview, which is like the Democratic Party worldview, which has become the party of the affluent more and more so, not of the fossil fuel industry, but certainly of Silicon Valley and Wall Street. And richer people support the Democrats more and more often. And they have this view, but they have kind of liberal sensitivities as well, so they mix it in. And so their view is that we, the affluent liberals, have made it in the world because we, have worked smarter, and, we're the cutting edge of the new economy, and we just need other people to get on board. And that's the Gates Foundation will talk about that, and, like, everybody's this is the ubiquitous worldview of the liberals, and they have a little bit more sympathy to helping up other people as well. And so really it's a view that's pretty much ubiquitous across the mainstream political spectrum. Is that it varies a little from liberals to conservatives, like I said, but pretty much they believe it's a meritocracy, and that the reason that certain communities aren't doing as well is because they're not doing the right thing. And liberals, to their credit, will be like, okay, we're going to, educate you, and we're going to try to bring some of you, these communities, these countries, whatever it is, through charity or through, funding college or whatever it is, into, our doing what we do, so you guys can be part of this new economy as well. And then conservatives are like, just get it together, and they'll use more dog whistly type language and stuff also. But the framework's kind of the same. And so I think it's important to ask, is it true? Like, is that the does that have the most explanatory power for why the vastly divergent outcomes for different communities and countries exists? And I would submit to the audience, and I think you probably have already figured this out, I don't think it is. Now, that's not to say I don't think there's anything to that argument. I think that there's, at least for the individual, it's a helpful framework to have. And that's actually, it's something that a lot of black conservatives will say, like Larry Elder and the folks. They'll be like, look, like, it's the problems with the community. I worked hard and I, did everything right. Now I'm a rich businessman. And then they, explain the rationale for pulling up the ladder behind them. And then they're pushed forward by other conservatives and people within the ruling class as being like, look at this, person from marginalized community X. He's saying that it's all your fault. We can't say that anymore because then we get, people say that we're espousing racial biases. But he can say it, and so he's helpful for us. And he's saying that he worked hard, and the reason you guys aren't making it is because you're not working as hard. And again, I'm not taking away that person's experience as an individual. And for individuals, it's true, and you can find a lot of cases, and usually those cases are the ones that are pushed forward by the conservatives and by documentary filmmakers and by society in general. Look at this, you kind of call it like, I don't know, hope porn or capitalist porn. Be like, oh, look at this person. Like, he was born in a ghetto without a mother, but then he used the carcasses of his family to construct a shelter and then taught himself how to code. And now he runs, this giant computer company. So look at capitalism. Look how great. And it's like, okay, there are people in that situation. And for that person that's in that terrible situation, it is a more helpful framework to say, this really sucks, let's put my nose to the grindstone and make the best out of it. And then if they do make it, which statistically they won't, but sometimes they do, but either way, they would do better, not just blaming the world for everything and doing what they can still do to better their situation. So that's true. But on the systemic level, it's clearly not true, and it could never be true, given that if one has a belief that like people are more or less the same and there are not like smarter and dumber populations, and so insofar as outcomes are different, it's because people have been socialized differently and have different opportunities that are presented to them because of things like settler colonialism and the history of slavery and government policies which haven't been rectified. If that's your belief for why the general disparities exist, which is what I'm about to argue, then holding up any one individual only obfuscates the larger problem. And so I'll use a couple of examples. One is countries, in terms of like, is it a coincidence that what are the wealthy countries? It's Europe, it's the United States, it's Australia, it's Canada. That's kind of like the first world. South America's not doing so hot. Central America's not doing so hot. Asia, not very much. I mean, there's different nuances. Antarctica, they're doing terrible. They're freezing to death and getting eaten by leopard seals. And so, what do those countries have in common? If you're following my train of thinking, those are all the countries that conquered all the other countries a few hundred years ago. Now, the conservative or the standard mainstream thinker, meritocratic thinker of today would say, yeah, but that was hundreds of years ago. Like, take some responsibility, millions or billions of individuals within those countries. Stop using Fernando Cortez as your explanation for why you can't get a job, you lazy old wreck. And insofar as anybody is blaming Hernando Cortez for why they can't get a job, I would kind of agree with them. But systemically, like, that's a pretty big coincidence. And it goes further, too, in that, you know what the wealthy countries were before colonialism? It was many of those other countries and continents. And, like, for instance, parts of India, like, I think Bengal was, like, one of the richest areas. Now it's, like, among the most impoverished areas in the world. And, there was some stuff that happened there with Britain and the like. And, or like in the Americas, people might have read the accounts of, what was the guy's name? De las Casas, the minister that was there with Columbus when he landed on Hispaniola. He's talking about like millions of people. I think he said there was 3 million people there. I don't know if that's accurate, but he's like, oh yeah, it was a total utopia. And these people like didn't know, what, you know, hard, brutal labor was, and there was nothing but, like, literally describes it as a utopia. And I don't know if that was totally historically accurate. But then Columbus came there, and he started chopping off everybody's hands for not bringing enough gold, and started enslaving them. And pretty soon they were all pretty much, like, dead. Now, if people know what's happening on Hispaniola, specifically in Haiti, it's like the most impoverished place in the entire world. And I won't go through the history of Haiti because I'm not a total expert on it, but a few bullet points that might be relevant. And Haiti, by the way, was one of the countries that Trump pointed out as like, why are we bringing these people in from shithole countries? Haiti was one of the ones he was talking about. And the implication being like, these shithole people made their country like a shithole. Now they're trying to shithole our country up too. We shouldn't do that. Well, maybe the reason that Haiti's a shithole, using their vernacular, is a few things that happened. One is that it was like the most profitable colony of, I think, like the 18th century for France, and like something like a third or a quarter, if I remember correctly, of all the wealth that went towards France in that time was coming directly from taking the resources of Haiti. And so that's one reason. And then eventually, then it was the first country to have a slave revolt, and which terrified the Americans. I think that was I want to say it was in 1812. That could be wrong, but I'll just roll with it. If it's wrong, I'll put it on the screen. So in the early 19th century, I believe, the first country to have a slave revolt, they threw France out. Terrified the Americans, who were totally terrified, the founding fathers, who were slaveholders, and specifically in the South, totally terrified of slave revolts themselves, because that's what our economy was based on too. Maybe I'll get to that in a moment when I talk about our communities. And so didn't even recognize Haiti as a country for like 50 years, until I think it was like 1860 or 1862. Now they're recognizing Haiti as a country, and it's like right next door to it, so they wouldn't even, doing everything they can to undermine them. And then the reason that we acknowledged it, I think it was Lincoln, is because there was, before or during the early part of the Civil War, they were like, okay, well, you know, we're abolitionists here, and it is good that they were abolitionists, but they were also still pretty racist, a lot of the mainstream ones, and they're like, okay, well, we don't want them to be slaves, but like, what are we going to do with all these black people after the war, after we abolish slavery? And they're like, we're going to send them to Haiti and Liberia. And they're like, well, we didn't even recognize Haiti was a country. They're like, we better recognize it so we can put all our black people there. So that's why the U.S. recognized Haiti as a country. Same with Liberia. And then during that time, I don't know exactly what it was, but then, so Haiti liberates itself in early 1800s from France. And then France, which had, you know, just been conquering, you know, killing tons of them and enslaving all of them, puts reparations onto Haiti. So Haiti has to send France reparations. And if I remember correctly, they were doing that well into the 20th century. So for like 100 years, Haiti is paying France reparations for liberating itself from that enslavement. And then you can go on. So that goes into, I want to say like the 1940s, but certainly into the 1900s. And at a certain point, Wilson invades Haiti, the U.S. invades Haiti. I don't know all the details of, but it's brutal repression. They open up the markets, U.S. corporations take over. That goes on for a long time. Then there's dictator after dictator, the Duvaliers. First the older one, then he dies, and the baby doc he was called, U.S. props up. And it goes into the 90s. There's more coups that are tacitly supported by the U.S. They throw out, what was his name? The Haitian president in 1994, Aristide, and then do the same thing again in 2004. The U.S. has, you know, support for it. And pretty soon it's the present. So that's all of the history of Haiti, and now it's a shithole country. And then, you know, conservatives will say, like, look at these, you know, shithole countries, we can't have that. And then, like, free market liberals, like, they're, you know, high-class society people, and they won't say that, you know, that type of stuff. We don't believe that. But they'll say, like, we need to liberalize markets and, like, you know, bring them into, we need to provide charity to these people. So rather than being like, we are the beneficiaries, we, the wealthy, not aristocracy, but the wealthy elite of civilized countries are the direct beneficiaries, oftentimes like directly from the gifts that they were given from their parents. What is that called? Inheritance. We are the beneficiaries of you know, this system going down the line, just like the people born into poverty, miserable poverty in Haiti, are opposite of the beneficiaries, or the beneficiaries of the worst outcomes of that. So we, but we want to help you, so we're going to give you some charity. So it's like, okay, the world is fair, and out of the goodness of our heart, we're going to give you some charity. And so that's a framework that, and then also with the charity comes like certain values which they expect those people to adopt and influence in those countries as well. And so that was a large tangent, but that's more or less a framework for the world. And so clearly the more prescient explanatory model is things that have happened and policies that were made that had influence in the country for most of its history, and made sure that things like wealth accumulation did not happen in certain places and did in other places. And that is obviously also true within countries, like in the United States. So in the U.S., like if you listen to the way that I'd say conservatives, I think it's fair to say, talk about black on black crime or poverty in the inner city. It's mostly with black people, but also with like other poor neighborhoods also. It's always from the framework of like, look at this rap music, look at these people not taking responsibility, where are the fathers? And it's like, okay, putting everything aside in terms of like the history of discrimination, which maybe I'll get into in a second, objectively the fathers aren't there, and objectively, I mean, some of them are, but it is a big problem in those communities. And objectively, having a two-parent household has better outcomes for children. But why do you think the fathers aren't there? Conservatives bringing it up. Do you think that it's because there's just something inherent in all of these different black communities that they've like decided that family isn't important? Because that is like, I'm not a person that goes around calling people racist all the time. I don't think it's productive, and it's super not helpful because people don't. I won't go into that too much. But if anything's racist, it's the belief that like there is a certain like genetic tendency or inherent tendency in a population of people, in this case black people, not to value family as much. Is that what you think? Okay, it's not what you think because you're not racist. Well, good. Well, then why are the fathers not there? Why are it must be then because of things that are different with the way that these communities emerge in comparison to other communities. I don't know if I have a conservative audience at all. I don't know if they would agree or disagree with that. But either it doesn't matter if they disagree or not, because that's the reason that it is. And I won't go through the details too much because I'm not an expert on it, but I know enough to know some of the stuff, and it's like important things that aren't like totally gone. Pretty much, did you know that once people stopped being slaves, the slaves actually didn't have very much money, and the slave owners did have quite a lot of money, and that those people are actually the ancestors of the people of today. And not only that, but there was like another 100 years or so where there was pretty active discrimination and even like criminalization of black life, so that things like chain gangs could continue, to make sure that that gap continued for another 100 years. And do you know that the places that are inner city communities or are poor black communities today are actually pretty much the same places as like those slaves moved and as their ancestors moved during Jim Crow? And when they moved there, most of the white, because they were all racist back then, pretty much everybody was racist until, well, I won't go into that too much, but what they did is all the white people moved away, and those communities got really poor. And then things like banks not lending to those communities and drawing what are called red lines around them continued, and the black-white wealth gap is persisted to this day. And then, as I said, there was criminalization of black life, and things like the drug war were a big part of that, and that continues today. Even though it's not, it's illegal to sentence a black man extra time just because he's black, but it's not illegal to look at all these black people. What drugs do they use? Oh, crack cocaine. Let's make that super illegal compared to regular cocaine, which funky white hipsters in the suburbs use more often. And oh, look at that. Looks like there's more black people in prison. Oh, it looks like you're in prison. You can't get a job afterwards. So that's gonna continue to persist the problem a little bit longer. And also, oh, you already started off with way less wealth. Well, too bad. Most trials in America don't actually. Sorry, most arrests don't. Most times, people don't actually go to trial because the court system is totally packed, and so people plead out. They have to plead out, or they just stay in prison without a trial unless they can make bail. Well, you can't make bail if you don't make money, and so that has a big impact on poor black people within those communities, the descendants of people that were actually discriminated against, you know, not that long ago even. And so the outcomes continue to be worse. And then some of those were fathers. And that, you know what that leads to? That leads to trauma within those communities. And I'm not a huge expert on this, but like childhood trauma is one of the biggest predictors of outcomes. And so that leads to further, you know, the children that go through that trauma, their outcomes aren't going to be as good also. So when you say, why can't you pull yourself up by your bootstraps as much as I can? A, because it's an impossible circus-like feat, which could never be done. But even if it could be, you know, you're not starting from the same spot. And so any kind of like discussion around macro pictures, whether it's global in nature, looking at different countries, or even local, looking at different communities or states, without like a real acknowledgement that insofar as one believes that people are pretty much the same, which is what biology says, and it's absolutely true, but are just shaped by their environment, then the reason is probably the gigantic influences which persisted for centuries, that you know, continue to shape environments that, if they're not rectified, continue to shape those environments today. And so it's not really productive to, you know, pick out things. Yeah, yes, there are different things that emerge. Like you got rap music in black communities compared to rock music in white communities. But like, really, is that really what you're really going to think? Like, you kind of have to, as a conservative, or as a whatever, as a capitalist, or someone that believes that meritocratic belief and that you know, things are more or less fair. Because if you don't believe it's fair, then you have to do something about it. Well, the system doesn't want to do anything about it. So the people at the top of it decide, well, you know, these aren't really problems anymore, and then they kind of have to justify it with that meritocratic belief system. But I don't think it's very right at all. And even like a cursory understanding of U.S. or global history demonstrates that.